Hi, I'm Tom Shue, and today I'm going to teach you guys how to adjust an image or develop an image without using any controls other than the tone curve. Now, when I say there's finishing touches that you can do to all your images, but to get your basic exposure and your color the way you want it, and the contrast set the way you want it, you don't have to use the sliders. What you can use is the tone curve. This tone curve here represents um, illumination of your entire image from darks to lights. So if you look at this, it's kind of like a histogram, okay? And the way they've set it up is they've set it up as highlights, mids, or shadows, mids, and highlights. And the way these sliders work is that the lights, if you look here, obviously the highlights is from here, 75 to 100. From complete black to solid white, it's 0 to 100. So from 75 over is where the highlights work. From 50 to 75 is where the lights work. From 50 to 25 is where the darks work. And then from 25 to 0 is where the shadows work. Now this is not locked in. You can change how much these sliders influence this image. Okay? So let's just go over some of the basic ways you can use this. First and foremost, you can just come in here and say that, you know that this is the highlights. So you can just grab this and pull it up and say, hey, I'm going to push the highlights up. And then say if you want to increase your shadow area, you can come over to this bottom part of the curve and raise up your shadow detail. Okay? And then say if you want your mid-range or the middle values of your image to be darker or lighter, you can increase or decrease it here. Okay? That's one way to do it. I'm going to reset this image. Another way you can do it is you can just grab this point here and come right out on the image and say, hey, these shadows, this area is too dark. I want it to be brighter. So you just click and you drag up. Okay? And that makes a point selection on your tone curve and allows you to drag up. Now you might say, well, my sky is too bright now. So I'll come over here to a portion of the sky that I want to be darker, and I just drag down. And now I've increased contrast there. Now I can come over here and adjust these sliders and say, hey, I don't want it to affect too much of the mid-range, so I can just bring this back down and say, hey, it only affects just the shadow area. And then I can also come over and adjust how that falls off into the mid-range just by grabbing this slider. So I can set an exact point where I want it to be. Then I could finish it off with, say, maybe a little bit of clarity, for example. Increase the clarity a little bit, and that will just change the way the image renders. Let's reset this. Okay, go back to our tone curve. Okay, this tone curve, like I said, has lots of areas where you can adjust it however you like, either by dragging into the screen or using these sliders. Also, it lets you work in RG and B values. So if I only want the blues of the image to be increased or decreased, I can do that as well. So the way this works, you come over here and you click here, and now you can see that it's a channel selection. So if I click on this little drop down, it's going to say red, green, or blue. That's going to affect all the channels. If I only want to affect the blue channel, I can do so. So I can come over here and say, hey, let's make the blues a little bit brighter, which would cool down the image. If I make the blues a little less bright, it's going to warm the image. So this is kind of like a color wheel. Matter of fact, it works exactly like a color wheel. Whatever color you select, it will increase itself or decrease itself, which would affect the opposite colors. So if you ever look at a color wheel, you'll see that there's a whole bunch of colors, from the full spectrum of colors. So if you select blue, it's complete opposite on the color wheel. If this was a color wheel, if I was drawing one here, if blue lived here, the color that's on the opposite side of it is what it will be affecting. Okay? So, and again, this is the highlights and shadow area. So I can drag this up and say I'm only going to affect the blue and the highlights, and I want those blues to be a little bit darker, which is going to make the image warmer. Now I can come down here to the shadow areas and say I can increase the blues, and that will cool off the image again, but just in the shadow area. Notice how our clouds stayed golden. All right. So we can also do that with the green channel. We know that greens are going to affect blues as well, so we can come into the mid-range and drop it down a little bit and give it some more magenta cast. And we can come to the highlights and increase it, and that will kill some of the magenta in the sky. And we can take some more out of the shadow area and kind of negate some of that magenta cast. Now our magenta cast is only in the mid-range. So now let's come over here to the red channel, and let's increase this a little bit, and that's going to increase the magenta, or down will decrease it and make it more green. So spend some time learning what a color wheel is, and you can come in and get exacting controls with your red, green, and blue channels with just this tone curve. This is a very powerful tool. It can be used to develop or post-work your images completely. It's a really fast way once you get used to using it. Again, remember, you can make specific selections. Let's go back to the RGB. We'll make specific selections to this image by just coming into the interface and dragging. So I want these blues to be a little bit darker, and I want my shadow areas to be a little bit lighter. All right, and I'll finish it off with a little bit of clarity and maybe a little bit of vibrance. So drag the clarity up a little bit and drag my vibrance up a little bit and maybe throw a vignette on it. So we'll come over here and grab the vignette tool, and I'll feather it. I want to see exactly where I'm at, so I'm going to grab this down here, and there's my midpoint. Let me take the feather off. So I want to affect the outside. I'll bring my midpoint back to the center here and drag my mount off. And then you can always come in and adjust your exposure, because this is a brightness slider. You should look at this exposure slider as your brightness slider. There you have it. I hope you guys take a minute and play with the tone curve. Get familiar with it, because it really gives you some exacting control inside Lightroom. These controls are pretty new to Lightroom. They've been exclusive to Photoshop, being able to manipulate the independent red, green, and blue channels. So I hope you all have a nice day, and thank you for taking time to visit my blog today. And until next time, we'll see you soon.